Before I begin our discussion on leadership, I'm going to share my most embarrassing early career mistake to illustrate a few points. So, as was the usual case for second-year interns in the 1980s, we worked in accident and emergency all night, resuscitating patients, mainly victims of major motor vehicle trauma. And after one particular 48-hour shift, I got to my car, exhausted and starving, and found that on my windscreen were two parking tickets, and the car was now in a clearway, and I hadn't realised that because I'd been working, and there it was, sitting alone in a major road in a clearway collecting parking tickets. So I was particularly irritated by this. I dropped in to the local supermarket, and without looking, I backed into a car, wiping out the bonnet of the other car. Fortunately, only the cars and my pride were hurt, but the mistake was deeply upsetting, and I still feel a little bit of a sting when I talk about it. I blame myself because to me it was a sign that I wasn't coping, which I felt that I couldn't confide in anyone. I had heard the whispered voices in corridors at the hospital about doctors who were not up to it, not pulling their weight, and not doctor material. And I didn't want to be in that category. So I put up with being miserable, and I didn't talk about it for fear of exposing my vulnerability. So I developed the necessary emotional shield and covered all of this up until a few years later, when I was working in my own general practice, I was called to an unconscious child on a Sunday morning, and I rushed to the family home, rushed through the door, resuscitated the child on the lounge room floor. She'd had a prolonged loss of consciousness due to a febrile convulsion, and she responded really well. And when I stood up to greet the parents, there they were, the people who I'd crashed into in the supermarket car park. So they were aghast, and I'm still not sure whether they were aghast because of what had just happened to their child, or the fact that they were trusting someone with their daughter's life, someone with such poor driving skills. So, as is the case with deeply painful experiences, they fade in time, they result in personal growth, and they even have a funny side sometimes in retrospect. And then the experience helps you transcend the next one. So I can see that you're a very kind audience, and of course you might be thinking, well, she shouldn't have blamed herself. It was the hospital system, the unsafe working hours, the fact that inexperienced doctors in their 20s were unsupervised and were not offered debriefing. It wasn't her fault. But I'd ask you, when you reflect on your own early career mistakes, are you as kind with yourself as you are with me? Are you aware that the unhealthy system within which you work sometimes sets you up for issues that you're actually not personally to blame? Do you sometimes have a blind spot to your own self-care? So the second part of the story continues. After my hospital training, I set up my practice in a rural town, and I continued to attend motor vehicle accidents on the dangerous highway near my practice, but it was very difficult to distance myself emotionally from this because the people involved in the car accidents were my patients. And I looked after their grieving families for prolonged periods. So no longer under the umbrella of the safety of the accident and emergency department. And I learned that paradoxically, the special relationships that we develop with our patients that give us so much joy can also be the source of our despair in our work, particularly when we're facing loss. So throughout my training, I developed excellent technical skills for resuscitation and all other parts of general practice. I could manage the technical aspects of resuscitation, but no one ever talked to me about how to manage the aftermath as a GP. And in that time, I didn't need resilience training. I feel that I had more fortitude and courage than I have now, and resilience training would not have worked. It was the system and the culture within which I was working that needed to be changed. So now I think you can see where I'm going with this. I use the motor vehicle accident trauma as a dramatic example, and I understand that Ewan McPhee yesterday used that example as well. But in fact, we can apply this example to any aspect of general practice, and we're exposed to an accumulation of trauma and negative experiences which can be harmful if we do not work through them properly. But let me make this really clear at the beginning. General practice is a fantastic career. I love being a GP. Thank you. We develop unique insights into life. We frequently witness love and courage and inspiration. We form close connections to extraordinary people. We gain deep satisfaction from helping a very diverse range of people. And we're continually learning about fantastic advances in medicine. We can engage in a wide variety of work, clinical work, teaching, research, and many other fascinating areas. And it's important to remember this every day and celebrate that. But we also have challenges, and I think we must confront them to transcend them, to be able to fully experience joy in our work. And that's what I will talk about today. So there's a substantial medical literature on the immense challenges facing the 21st century GP. The high rates of stress, self-medication, mental illness, suicide, in part related to high levels of bullying, harassment and discrimination, which are at the tip of the iceberg of our negative culture. And I'm not going to take up your time today with statistics. If you want to read more about it, I'm sure you've read the 2013 Beyond Blue survey of medical students and doctors. They surveyed 14,000 Australian doctors and medical students. But of even more concern to me is that we're not making progress on these issues. We're actually continuing to read about them even in the general media and social media. We're hearing heart-wrenching stories from families of young doctors who have died by suicide, and Senate inquiries into bullying in the profession and so on. And I think we do have to confront this. The presidents and chairmen of our medical organisations have held many round tables, they've made media statements, they've spoken at conferences like this. Everyone knows about the availability of doctors' health advisory services, so how can there be little progress on achieving outcomes? So today I would like to put forward some strategies for discussion. And here's an outline of the three themes of my presentation today. So I'm putting forward some solutions. Every GP healthier, every GP creating a healthier medical culture, and every GP a leader. So firstly, every GP healthier. So let's take the example of mental health and suicide. In the late 90s, I served on the Victorian Premier's Suicide Prevention Task Force with a diverse group of people, actually including the late Jim Steins. And we did a wide community consultation. This was at a time when youth suicide was particularly high in Victoria. And we put forward recommendations across a framework of prevention, early intervention, intervention and post-vention. And the role of the GP across all those domains was emphasised. So this was nearly 20 years ago. Now, the recommendations that came out of that report were fully funded across those domains, and they actually impacted on the statistics. And I think that what we need to do is to look at our evidence, the things that work, and implement them in our own profession. And I think we need to look at these domains when we're caring for doctors' health. So for prevention, every doctor needs an annual comprehensive preventive health assessment for general preventive health screening, including mental health screening, and that complies with our RACGP Red Book. Early intervention, every doctor needs to attend a GP, I think, at least every 6 months, just for routine debriefing on experiences that may have happened. Intervention, every doctor needs a GP if they have a mental illness, and for that to be managed properly. Postvention, and this is a very important one, every doctor needs a trusted GP in case of a crisis for acute debriefing after exposure to trauma, especially if that trauma is related to suicide. And yet only 50% of us have our own GP, and even when we have our own GP, I'd argue that we do not use our own GP to the level of that we require, to this level of support. So in late 2016, I put up a draft website called medicineisbeautiful.com on some of the topics around doctors' health based on my work being a doctor's doctor. I had a clinic in Melbourne for about 5 years seeing doctor patients, and so it was based on that work and also my Doctor of Medicine on cognitive behavioural therapy. But these, I've written personally about some of the things that work for me. And it seems to have resonated with doctors. It's just a draft, it's just word of mouth, but it's actually had tens of thousands of hits. One of the popular preventive strategies on the site, because I can monitor what people are looking at, is how to deal with immense pressure. So we inevitably face immense pressure, and I believe we need to have a really proactive strategy for dealing with those days that are just a bit tough. And so this is what works for me. I've written about a 3-step process based on reprioritising, recharging and reviewing, and I'll just briefly go through that. Now, what I'd like to suggest you do when I'm describing this process is think about your own strategy, because what works for me may not work for you, but the most important point that I'd like to make here is that we all need a strategy that works for us personally. So firstly, I reprioritise. I write down everything that's worrying me, everything on my mind. I have a white piece of paper, from the most serious to the fears I've got at the moment about the North Korea, to the most irritating minor thing about having an extra charge on my credit card, to how sad the patient with catastrophic injury was on Monday, and I write it all down. I sometimes find that there are things, subconscious things in my mind that I wasn't really aware of that actually have been in the back of my mind, and I put those on the paper as well. I then look at the piece of paper and I reassure myself it's natural to feel stressed because I have got so many things on my mind. This is actually, it's actually a normal response, so I reassure myself. I then work through the list. I work out what I can influence and what I can't influence, and I cross out the things I can't influence. Sometimes I have to accept them. But I use my cognitive behavioural therapy skills to be able to rethink the other things that I do have influence over, and I try to find solutions for them. And very often I find that a lot of things are actually within my control, and I work out a plan. I also work out the faulty thinking, and I delete the junk thoughts, like deleting my junk folder from my email. So I practice acceptance and cognitive challenging my negative thinking. I meticulously time manage. So the way I work this out is I've got 168 hours in the week. I need about 56 hours for sleeping. I work about 40 hours, and that actually leaves me with a surprising 70 hours a week, which is my flexible time. Sure, I have family commitments and other things that I have to do, but I can choose what I do with that time. And so I'm very careful about where I put my priorities, who I spend my time with, not worrying about things that I can't influence. Sure, sometimes family illness or other crises make the week really difficult, and I can't do that, but that's usually temporary. It's not permanent, and so I'm able to understand that this is a short-lived period that I can get over. Secondly, I recharge. When I recharge, I know it's more effective to recharge to 100% than only to 10%. If I only recharge to 10%, I'm going to run out of battery really easily. So I make sure I have self-care as a priority. That means that I spend time with people I love, I use positive psychology, I'm grateful for things, my health, my family, the simple kindness and beauty. And I just stop now to acknowledge that I'm showing you some beautiful scenery today. And these slides mean a lot to me, and I use them for you, but I actually also use them for me because they're my husband, who is also a GP, has taken these photos on holidays, and we love beautiful nature, and it really helps us recharge. And don't we live in a beautiful place? So you might have recognised there's Tasmania, the Ningaloo Reef, Fraser Island, and you might recognise places that you love as well. And I love those images. I also have worked out, after many years, it's important to say no. When I say no, people don't like it and they push back, and I have to be ready for that without feeling guilty, and I've learnt to do that over my career, but that's a bit tough. And finally, I review my goals. So when I'm feeling stressed, it's usually because work has become too dominant in my life, and it helps me to review goals across all of my life. And here are some of the headings that I use. So to look at where my priorities are. So my spiritual life, am I caring for my soul? Am I doing things that inspire me? My legacy, am I aware of my big picture about what I want to achieve in my life? People, which relationships are important to me? Am I spending time with people I love? Mental health, what gives me joy? Physical health, how can I build more exercise into my routine, look after my physical health? My personal life, what activities energise me? And then my security is also important, so financial situation. Financial security is an important goal. It's really important that we're secure. But if money becomes too prominent in our lives, it can be very destructive. How much money is enough? So I thought you might like the sandwich board on the right of this slide. It's outside a local wellness clinic close to where I live in Melbourne. And it's a reminder that there's actually a lot of snake oil in the wellness industry, and that there are a lot of things out there that that industry puts forward that actually are very ineffective and don't work. So the message with this is, find a strategy that works for you in times of immense stress, because it helps you recover quickly. It helps you get back to your balance so that you can do your important work. And after revisiting my goals, I asked myself this question, this lovely question from Mary Oliver. Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life? So it's a big picture question. it helps you transcend some of the grind, some of the inevitable everyday challenges that you have, because you can be focused on a big picture. So let's shift now to every GP creating a healthy culture through building healthy clinical teams and caring for our colleagues. Sometimes individual strategies don't work in negative or toxic cultures. Sometimes we need to work on the culture, not on ourselves. And I'd like to focus on these two strategies now. Many of you will have worked in healthy clinical teams, and isn't it a joy to do that? You would recognise some of the features of healthy environments where everyone's view is respected. Unfortunately, many of us would have worked in dysfunctional clinical teams, and I'm sure, like me, you've attended many committee meetings that tend to be dominated by a few people, where people speak over the top of each other, where they don't effectively tap into the knowledge and the skills of all team members. Superficially, there's sometimes a veil of politeness, but team members can hold grudges, they avoid difficult conversations or conflict, and because people skirt around the real issues, there's no real outcomes in the meetings, which is very dissatisfying, and if there are actions, sometimes they're not followed through. Sometimes there's a toxic culture where unconscious bias, bullying, discrimination and harassment are not called out, and this is very toxic. So there are many shades of grey between the dysfunctional and the functional clinical teams, and I'm sure you've worked across all of them and you know the characteristics well. What I think are the two key features of a healthy culture are diversity and inclusion. And all of us as leaders need to ensure that wherever we work, in every committee, in every organisation that we work for, that we stand up for diversity and inclusion. One of the other effective ways to change a culture is to care more for our colleagues. Could I ask you to think about your most difficult colleague or registrar for a moment? And could I ask you to question whether they could be exhibiting atypical signs of underlying mental illness? Are they irritable, withdrawn, combative? Are they taking time off work at short notice? These may be signs of a mental health issue, of course. So one of the most obvious indicators of a caring culture is when leaders and others stand by a colleague through difficult times or when they're exhibiting challenging behaviours. And I think there's two ways we can do this. Firstly, ensuring our colleague gets the right professional help. We shouldn't become a doctor to other doctors in our practice or in our network. We can be their friend, but we can help them get the right professional help. Secondly, if you are caring for another doctor as a patient, you can give them the same high standard of care that you give to your other patients. So many of us look after other doctors, and I don't believe it necessarily requires additional training or skills. We need to be good listeners, we need to protect confidentiality, we naturally adjust our approach to different levels of health literacy. We adjust our approach to people with poor health literacy. We can also adjust our approach to people with high health literacy. But I would ask, do we give doctors the same standard of mental health care that we give to our other patients? So here's a reminder of the features of a comprehensive mental health history. And I'm not suggesting that we give our doctor patients questionnaires, but I'm suggesting that we listen for these features of the mental health history. You know, do we sometimes leave out the developmental history because we fear that we are intruding? I think we need to be more comfortable with really listening to what is behind our patient's issue. But there is one question that we must ask our colleagues, and this is perhaps one of the most difficult questions. So for our other patients, we've been trained to ask in signs when there's excessive stress. In this, many people who are under pressure feel like harming themselves. Have you ever felt like this? It's actually not easy to say this to a colleague, but it's essential. And I'd like to focus now on some issues related to suicide risk, because it's such an important issue for our profession. So here again are some of the risk factors for suicide in the general population that you already know, and but these risks are just as common in our doctor patients. I'd also like to point out that there are some subgroups in our profession where some of these risk factors are more prevalent. For example, female doctors, like many women in the community, may also have additional risk factors, including increased prevalence of stress, depression, anxiety, eating disorders, post-traumatic stress responses, postnatal depression, intimate partner and patient violence, childhood sexual abuse, and exposure to workplace bullying, harassment and discrimination, all requiring special care. And I would also emphasise the fact that for many people who have been exposed to violence as children, when they see patients with similar issues, it triggers issues for them, and they need to work through this. They need to be debriefed. They need to confront it. And for both genders, there's risks related to self-medication and access to lethal means, exposure to traumatic death and suicide. And I think we've failed to tailor our interventions to meet the diverse needs of our profession. So the reasons why doctors don't tend to seek help are complex. Many people talk about fears of confidentiality and fears of mandatory reporting, but I feel that these fears are somewhat misplaced. Our profession's current focus on blaming mandatory reporting and the medical board I don't think is helpful. I think it is important to have nationally consistent laws, and I think it is important to have the discussion. But with that discussion needs to come a reassurance that it is not necessary to report doctors with mental health issues. Let's be clear, mandatory reporting is only relevant if doctors are placing the public at risk of substantial harm because of a health issue, which is rarely the case. I've looked after hundreds of doctors as patients. I've never had to even consider reporting anyone. I often find doctors comply really well with treatment. They take time off when they need to. It's just not even a part of my work. And like other patients, the confidentiality of doctors' health information is protected by strict privacy laws, and we all know that we mustn't breach those. So I think we need to reassure not only GPs, GP registrars and medical students, but doctors of other specialties that as GPs we are very competent and confident to look after them, and we will give them the same high standard of care that we give to our other patients across the 4 domains of prevention, early intervention, and postvention. So none of what I've said so far is new to you, but currently there's a big gap between knowing and doing, and this is where leadership comes in. Why do we have a gap? Perhaps it's lack of self-awareness, perhaps it's a blind spot to our own need for self-care, a lack of prioritisation, perhaps it's even a lack of leadership. And we can change this, but it takes our collective leadership. The people in this group are a very powerful group. We actually have the power to change this on a national level, but we have to do it with a groundswell of care. And that's why I've focused on this issue. As hard as it is today, I know that as GPs you are experienced with dealing with the hardest issues, but we need to confront them properly to be able to transcend them, work through them and find solutions. And so I hope that I've left you with that I'm interested in finding solutions to what are actually solvable problems. So in closing, every GP a leader. Leadership training, like the wellness industry, is a profitable commercial industry. Recently on a flight, I was sitting next to someone who said that they were a leadership guru, and he makes a living talking to corporates, including big banks, about authentic leadership. And he probably sensed that I wasn't overly impressed with his cliches and his marketing spiel. He said, just a GP, when I answered his question about what I did. And clearly the RACGP, I'm a specialist in life, campaign had not impacted on this man. So in the medical world, training for medical leadership and coaching is a comparatively untouched space. Perhaps because we tend to distrust weasel words and marketing speak. And there are not many good role models amongst our political and corporate leaders. I think despite our cynicism, though, we need to take another look at medical leadership and redefine it. Together, we work in a complex, changing environment, and we're witnessing transformational advances in medical, surgical and e-health technologies, particularly in the last decade. In the next decade, further subspecialisation of medicine and the disruption of our unsustainable health systems are inevitable, and we need leadership to get through this. There are many problems with our current health system which are directly impacting on our work as GPs, and we require collective leadership for this. And this is beyond the issues like medical homes and Medicare indexation, which of course are important, but I think we need a bigger picture view. We should be very concerned about growing health inequities. We need to be involved in community debates, such as the one in Victoria on medical assisted dying. Our medical leaders of our organisations are often solitary figures who are frequently under fire internally and externally. They tend to hold their positions for relatively short periods due to outdated organisational constitutions, and this makes it very difficult for them to achieve real outcomes for our profession and our patients, and they really need our support. But more than this, I think what's required is a different medical leadership philosophy, where every doctor recognises their own position as a collaborative leader in their everyday work, whether they're a clinician, educator, researcher or administrator. In medicine, everyone matters, not just a few at the top of the pecking order. A different definition of high-impact everyday medical leadership is about enabling others, our colleagues, our registrars, our students, and we need training programs to do this. I've seen limited leadership training programs but I think we need to open these to the whole profession. So to come back to where I started, my themes for today: every GP healthier, every GP creating a caring culture, every GP a leader. How do we find the time to be a leader? The WHO classification of diseases has grown to distinguish more than 30,000 different diseases, and we have at our disposal tens of thousands of medical and surgical procedures and medications. So that's a lot to get our head around, and that's a lot to teach. So how do we find time in our crowded medical curriculums for leadership as well? So to illustrate my point, I'll close with just another brief story, which was a turning point of my early career. Many years ago, I arrived at my son's primary school late after being delayed at work, seeing some challenging patients. And I sat alone in the schoolyard, contemplating why I work, already feeling guilty that I was not getting the work and life balance right and letting my work affect my family. And my children had been sent to school care, after school care, as their mother had failed to turn up on time, and all the parents in the audience would know what a crime this is. So my heart sank when my son's teacher called me into the class to speak to me. And that day the class had been asked to nominate people who have changed the world. And there amongst the Queen, Gandhi, Mother Teresa, and the Prime Minister, I recognised my son's handwriting. Leanne Rowe was also on the whiteboard. And at that time, I'd felt like a struggling, undervalued GP. And when I collected my sons from after-school care, I admitted that I was worried that my work was stressing our family. And they said to me, from grade 4 and grade 2, "You've taught us never to give up. Don't give up." So I've received a number of awards throughout my career, but they pale into insignificance compared with that moment and that recognition by my children of my leadership in my local community. And so the question, therefore, is not how you will find time to be a leader. When you are finding your work challenging, you are demonstrating leadership, and you will find deep satisfaction and joy in responding with fortitude and courage. Perhaps the right question is, tell me, what is it that you plan to do with your one wild and precious life? And I hope your answer will be to lead. Thank you.
We have some time for questions, and thank you so much, Leanne. That was very inspiring. How do we help the registrars see this as relevant in training when their head's around clinical, just get through the exams? What tips or opportunities would you suggest that perhaps the supervisors might be able to try when they've got maybe some protected teaching?
Yeah, it's hard to fit it into a crowded curriculum. I think by telling stories, I think stories are really powerful to illustrate points. I think that it's a matter of finding the time. So when I talk about meticulous time management, I take that really seriously so that I actually free up my time so that I have time for thinking, for deep work, for writing. These are all the things that rejuvenate me. And in the end, they save me time. You know, if I can work on the things that are really important and the priorities, then I tend not to have the crises that are so time-consuming. So I can have a more balanced life. So in fact, I think that some of the strategies I've talked about today actually save time. It's not that I'm suggesting you do anything particularly you do anything extra. I've heard the argument, people have said to me, oh, we need to talk more about the positive things to our registrars and students, and I agree with that. I absolutely agree with that. We need to tell them about the joy that we find in our work and the deep satisfaction that comes with continuity of care and looking after people over long periods of time. And often students and registrars don't experience that because they're moving every 3 months and they have short terms, and so they don't actually experience the part of the work that gives us the most joy. So I think it's really important to talk about that. But I have had colleagues say, "Oh, don't talk to them about the don't talk to them about the negative things." I did some work on patient-initiated violence for a while, and some people said, "Look, don't tell the registrars about that." But actually, I think I disagree with that point of view, because the registrars are going to experience these things. Would be as foolish as saying, well, cardiac arrest is not very pleasant, let's not talk about that part of it, No, we don't do that. We say, well, actually, cardiac arrest, we have to do training every year to make sure we're technically really good at that. And this is my point with the work on leadership. We can give them training to do leadership as well, and they are natural leaders in their everyday work. It's about collaborative leadership. So, and I see that it is actually hard to see you up the top, actually. So maybe that's why I'm frowning a bit too much. But I would ask people, just to challenge you a little bit, you've already been in this conference 1 or 2 days, and often the same people ask the questions. And I know that there are the quiet people amongst you, the introverts like me, who have important things to say but often do not ask the questions. And I'd really ask you to be brave enough to join in the discussion, because I think we've got a little bit more time, haven't we, Lachlan? What time are we finishing?
I think we're finishing at 10.
At 10, yeah. So we've got another 20 minutes, and I'd be really delighted to engage with you on this.
Maybe just introduce yourself and then the question.
Hi Leanne, thank you very much. My name's Maurice Madros, I'm a medical educator at GP Synergy.
Mm-hmm.
A reflection, I suppose, on point number 1 melded with point number 3. Mm-hmm. Could I request that we lead by example and get our own GP? Yeah. So as a medical educator, I say some of what you've said to my registrars, and I encourage them to get their own GP and have a preventative checkup every 6 months and look at it as an oil service and a car service and a tune-up. Start as you mean to go along, as my husband says. And they all nod and look at me, and they've got no intention of doing it. Yeah. But we're not role modelling it.
No.
I have my own GP,
you.
and I don't want to embarrass everyone, but seriously, if I ask you all to put your hands up, although I know I've got a biased selection of people, we're not leading by example. And that may be just a simple commitment that we can walk out the door with of get my own GP, do that, and talk to my registrars. And I think the supervisors, as well as the MEs, could be doing that. And I think the fear is not just the mandatory reporting, it's that fear of weakness, it's that vulnerability, and it's reminding them we're all human, stuff's just going to happen to us. So let's embrace it rather than fight it. So there's not really a question in there, but
no, thank you.
But thank you. Unless you had any other tips.
No, thank you so much for that, because we need to model that. Does that make sense? Does it make sense, the prevention, early intervention, intervention and postvention, by having a regular we know this, we're GPs. You trust your GP. So if you have a crisis, you can go back to that person and they'll know you, and it's so much easier. So develop that relationship with them. But we all, could we actually seek a commitment of everyone in this room that they will model that, and then they will go back to their communities and they will recommend that really simple framework across those 4 domains for all the registrars. That would make the most tremendous difference to our profession. That would demonstrate collaborative leadership. That's what I'm talking. That's why I use the example of Doctors' Health, because I think that we are failing. We are failing in our leadership by allowing this. I've been watching this for a decade, and we are not shifting the statistics around suicide or depression or bullying. Only a few days ago there was a report on bullying in accident emergency departments. So I'd like to also say that as GPs we need to take leadership amongst other colleges, because other specialists are our patients as well. I'd also like to emphasise the point I made that you don't have to have special kind of skills to be a doctor's doctor. In fact, I personally chose to go to a GP registrar as my GP. She's now graduated, but she listens, she's collaborative, I can trust her. She doesn't have to know everything. In fact, when I've been looking after doctors, the first thing I realise is that I should not be defensive about not knowing stuff. I mean, I'm seeing doctors of all specialties. They actually know a lot more than me. It's better not to pretend that you can't know everything, but I know where to look it up, and I will give you an objective opinion. I know who to refer you to. I know how to manage this for you, but I don't have to know everything. So again, it's about not only seeking help regularly and normalising that, just a normal routine thing to do, but also being prepared to be a doctor's doctor. But I'd say just be careful of your boundaries. Don't become your registrar's doctor. Keep your boundary there. And we've got the availability of telehealth and all sorts of lovely, innovative technologies that now help us do that to access care in remote areas, and we're not utilising it, and we need to.
I think we have a question at the back there, and then over this side.
Thanks very much, Dr. Rowe. Lisa Fraser's my name. I'm a medical educator with GP Training Queensland. Mm-hmm. I feel like that was a talk that I've been really waiting for, so thank you very much. I just wanted to also echo August, say that the role modelling strategy I think is a very useful one, and I'm going to be committed to doing that. I guess I think registrars are really ready for this. I really am going to try and share as much of this as I can with them. I'm a new fellow, so I'm still very connected to that population. Mm-hmm. And so I guess I want all of us to go away and to apply problem solving and go away and apply some time to each of the issues that you've raised, so that we can actually take the first steps. And I suppose the other thing I wanted to say was using a systemic approach, or a heaps analysis kind of approach to some of the narratives and stories that we talk about in order to find solutions.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you for that. Thank you for that comment.
And over this side.
Hello, can you hear me? Yes. My name's Vicky McCartney. I'm a rural GP and a supervisor. I guess I've been watching some of the information coming from hospitals about the dire straits of mental health for young doctors in training. And it seems like an obvious place for GPs. And I just wonder what your opinion is in terms of, is there a place for GPs to be working within hospitals in a pastoral care role? And also, is there a place for a private general practice to be attached to hospitals as a given, because these doctors don't necessarily have a relationship with a GP, and their work hours tend to sort of put a barrier up for that?
Thank you for that question. So I know that some hospitals have doctors' health programs, but I actually think it's better to teach people to use GPs in the community, because I think if you set up clinics in hospitals, there's that issue of, I don't want to be waiting in that waiting room because people will know why I'm there. So there's such a emotional shield, there's such a barrier to seeking help that we have to offer the service in confidential ways. And I think we need to utilise video conferencing more and telehealth for people working shift work and so on, or after, for after hours, because it has to be confidential. It has to be actually distant from the workplace. I think it has to be completely separate from the colleagues. You have to absolutely protect the confidentiality. What I found in my experience of setting up a clinic only for doctors in the Melbourne CBD was that actually I frequently I would see people usually in a crisis, and then when I'd help them through the crisis, I recognised that it was actually better for me to link them in to a GP closer to where they lived, and someone who they didn't know. And because, fortunately, I've got lots of networks across Melbourne, I was able to kind of handpick a GP that I thought would suit them, and I would carefully refer them to that person for long-term care, because I knew that as an individual, it's very hard to offer continuity of care when you're doing this on a part-time basis, but the GPs in the community were really well placed for that. So I would like to support, the model of general practice that we have as being perfect as it is, that we don't need to set up special clinics, actually. And I'd like to, again, emphasise that every one of us has the capacity to look after doctors. You don't need to be the special doctor's doctor.
They're queuing for you on this side, Leanne.
You're right.
Thanks. Graham Emblin from an educator with General Practice Training Queensland and Northern Territory. I just wanted to stretch the thinking a little bit around us teaching leadership. I've been to leadership courses and I come away from them with not very much. New words, but not skills or concepts.
Yeah.
And I worry about putting a session or something into our workshop program on leadership, because I see that as being tokenistic. The way I think we can teach leadership involves a couple of components and things that I've learnt over the years. By being open about what we do and how we do it and how we're thinking and why we're making choices with the people around us is one part of how you can learn the leadership. And then encouraging people to then reflect what they're doing and what they're thinking and why they're doing it. Because leadership is often more about understanding the motivations. Yes, there are the communication skills, but relational leadership is actually more about understanding people, what drives them, and help them understand how they can create change, more than it is by going to a workshop.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, because I couldn't agree with you more. In fact, I chose to, rather than give you a didactic kind of PowerPoint on leadership theory, I chose to tell you stories and take a little bit of a risk with tackling a tough topic that I thought you might use as an example of why we need collaborative leadership. So that's exactly why I chose to present to you in this way. If you remember, I opened with that discussion with the leadership guru and the weasel words and the marketing spiel, and I agree with you. I've been to a lot of commercial, corporate leadership. I'm on a number of corporate boards, and I've been able to go to these leadership programs, and I often come away thinking, this is not authentic leadership, this is not transformational, this doesn't apply to medicine. So I do think there's a need for us to model the behaviours, for all of us to create healthy teams and so on, and to understand that in our everyday work we are already leaders. But like every aspect of our work, I think we can be open to training. And I know that there are some skills that I wish that I'd had 20 years ago. It would have made me much more effective in my roles in advocacy and my writing and so on. And I think these are skills that we can teach. So, for example, even around how to hold a meeting, how how to really get how to chair a meeting, how to get an effective outcome, how to get people all aligned, how to drive consensus. These are actually skills that can be learned. And so then there are a huge array of these things that really do apply to medicine. So again, getting back to my point, I think we need to redefine what good medical leadership is. It's not the solitary person standing on the cliff, the chairman or the president. It's actually the people, that everyone is important, everyone assists that person in their leadership. So I do believe that there's training that can be very effective. I think one common area is actually management of conflict and debate. Some of the healthiest organisations I've worked with are not afraid of conflict and debate. They realise that it's actually really constructive, it's a way of moving forward, it's a way of getting the best outcomes, the best ideas. In being inclusive, everyone expresses their ideas. I used to be actually a bit of a conflict avoider. Now I love the debate, I love the conflict. I've been trained to work that way. It's very constructive, it's not personal, it actually strengthens relationships. So that's just one example of things that I've found really helpful in leadership training, and I think that we can all learn that as well. And again, think about that. If we actually took that one example of making our meetings more effective, how much more productive we would be, so I'd put that to you.
We have 3 people standing and probably enough time for those questions over this side.
Hello, I'm Jenny Parsons. I'm a medical educator with MCCC in Victoria, and I've been very fortunate to have a GP for the last 25 years, and it's been a fantastic relationship for me and kept me relatively sane all this time, so that's good. I've just got a couple of comments. One is that I live in rural Victoria, but my GP is in Melbourne still. And I think for people in rural areas, it's really difficult to find a GP that is not in your practice or not that's a regular colleague.
Yeah.
And so it's not just confidentiality, it's about that whole kind of just wanting someone who's independent. So I think that can be difficult, and maybe, telehealth and things like that are one sort of option, but I think even that's not quite the same. You'd have to have a relationship first.
Yeah, it's not,
And so it can be that situation, water all around, but not a drop to drink. You're surrounded by doctors, but finding the right one for you can be difficult. The other thing I want to say is that I've also been fortunate enough to be, a GP for a number of doctors, and that's also been a great experience. I would say that you don't need any special skills, you just need to treat the patient according to their needs. And along those lines, I've had a couple of instances as a patient where I've been treated differently, and it's been very difficult. Like either you're treated like a colleague or you're given short shrift sometimes, not by my GP but by other people. And one of the instances where someone was probably trying to be quite helpful was just copying me in on the pathology result. But unfortunately, the surgeon who did that then went on holidays the next day, and I received in the mail a cancer diagnosis, which, there I was at the letterbox opening this thing up with nobody to do debrief. And I think, that's one of the real risks. He thought he was doing the right thing, but for me it wasn't very helpful.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Jenny, for sharing that. So it's so disappointing to hear those stories. So I wondered if there's anyone in the audience from South Australia, because I understand that the South Australian Doctors' Health people have set up a telehealth service. Is anyone... Are you able to tell us about that?
Hello, Leanne. It's Jill Benson.
Jill.
We have set up a telehealth service with Doctors Health South Australia, and that's been quite successful. So we particularly use that for rural and remote doctors who want to access our service. We have specific hours, we have appointments made as we do. So we run a doctor's health service out of hours on a Monday night, a Wednesday night and a Saturday morning. So there are 5 of us who run that health service. We also have a list of GPs and we have a 24 hours a day, 7 days a week phone service. So this is an extra service on top of that. So the doctors in the rural areas make appointments with the GPs, and the GP can be in their own house. They don't have to be in South Terrace. So they make the appointment. It's like a normal consultation, but it's done with telehealth, and we've just started and it's been going well.
Congratulations on that, because I think that every state needs to look at the example of South Australia.
So we've got maybe 2 last quick questions up on this side.
Kirsty Douglas from Interchange General Practice in Canberra and from the ANU. I just wanted to echo and congratulate the speakers so far, and absolutely confirm the need for GP. My own one for the last 25 years has been enormously valuable to me. But I wanted to move on to the sort of other ways we might be able to take leadership. And I think for this group, I think it may be important to look at some of the diversity in our training and our college. And I have great concerns that over the last 5 years we've seen a gradual eroding of the flexibility of training. And I think that has real repercussions for registrars coming through, both male and female, particularly anybody who's got young children. I myself, for a long time, held the record in Australia for taking the longest to get through the FMP training program at 12 years. It hasn't held me back. I believe I'm a competent GP, and I now hold a senior role in an academic department. People train in different ways in different times and have hugely variable life challenges, and if we're going to be able to support the best and most diverse GPs, then I think we have to really, as a group of medical educators and medical supervisors, push back a little bit against some of the much more restrictive issues that are coming through from college censors and through Commonwealth Department contracts with RTOs. But we need to make sure that we have a diverse training program so we can have a diverse group of GPs. And I think this group is a good group to take leadership on that.
Thank you. Thank you. So you've just demonstrated leadership. Thank you. Thank you. So we have as GPs, have so many important issues facing us that we have to advocate on, and that is an issue really close to my heart, the need for flexibility, the need for diversity, for women. I think there are still some really big barriers against women in our profession, and again, we have to confront them, and we need advocates, and we can't do this as a single person. We need collective leadership to support you in that advocacy. So thank you. You've given us a beautiful demonstration. Thank you.
Lucky last, our international guest.
Hello there. My name's Liza and I'm from New Zealand. I wanted to thank you very much for your talk. It made me reflect that our program has been greatly enriched by me coming here. So I wanted to share something with you that the talk made me reflect on, and Lachlan's question made me reflect on. In our program, and you may do this, excuse me if you do, but we get the registrars to tell their life story. And that happens throughout the program. One person does it each time. And that's a way that they actually demonstrate leadership. They can talk about their story in whatever depth they want to talk. But most of them reveal amazing journeys that have got them to that point and enable the educators to see ways that they can then develop them as leaders in different sessions due to their expertise or experience. And the relationships that then are generated within the group are lifelong relationships because they know each other on a very different and significant level. So I just wanted to share something for you because our program has been so much enriched by me coming. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for that gift. And I think that you do hear colleagues' stories and you realise that actually we're a really resilient group. And this is where, you know, in the past we've offered resilience training and so on. Actually, it's bigger than that. It has to be bigger than that. So thank you so much for that comment, because I think that the work that you're doing is really beautiful, actually.